Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Keith Preston, Terminal Philosophy, and Logos for another roundtable session. And Keith, you mentioned, can class solidarity be maintained in a diverse society? So why don't you sort of outline the problem here?
Well, the reason that I'm interested in this topic is because increasingly I'm seeing a lot of commentary coming from the left concerning the idea that there needs to be class solidarity and things of this nature, because socialism and ideas related to that, class politics and all of that, are starting to become popular once again, at least among certain sectors of the left. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The economic situation in the United States being the main one. And so increasingly I'm seeing commentary where it has an almost like an old line Marxist position, where it says, well, what we really need to do is have working class solidarity. And you have some people from the left that are saying, maybe we've gotten too carried away with some of this identity politics and things like that. Maybe we need to focus more on the working class. And there's a number of thinkers who've argued this. Usually they have some kind of social democratic perspective, or sometimes a further left perspective. But Caleb Maupin, to some degree, argues this. He's a Marxist-Leninist. The Chapo Trap House, or Trap House Chapos, or whatever, the dirtbag left, they call them. I've seen them or heard them make arguments like this. Crystal Ball, who's on the Rising TV program, she argues for this. And the Jacobin magazine has a number of writers with this perspective. So you have some folks that are saying, well, we need to move more towards a class-based politics. And of course, they get attacked by other sectors of the left, where they say, well, what you're advocating is class reductionism. What we really need is intersectionality, which is where, race and class and gender and disability and sexual orientation and all these other things are intersecting with each other. And then, of course, you have others. You have these critical race theorists who say, no, everything's about race, and even the white working class is a privileged class and has white privilege and all of that. I see a lot of back and forth going around between these groups over this kind of stuff. But it does raise the issue of whether a cross-sectional working class movement would be possible in the United States at this point. And what these folks will say is, well, we need a multiracial working class movement, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, multi-everything, meaning we need to transcend all of these tribal boundaries in favor of class solidarity. And this is fairly close to the historic Marxist position, which was that workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, the workers have no country. And we saw how well that worked historically when the World War I came. The working classes and the social democratic parties of virtually every country backed their respective national government in the war. The Americans were actually the one exception, I believe. So a lot of thinkers that came out of that, the Frankfurt School thinkers and Antonio Gramsci and many others said, well, what the problem there was cultural, that everybody, the working class had been inculcated by the educational system and by the state and by religion with all these other values like patriotism or whatever, and they didn't really understand their class interests, and they acted against their class interests. And that kind of thinking started to make a comeback probably as far back as the 90s, certainly about the early 21st century. You had writers like Thomas Frank, who wrote the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And Frank's thesis was one that back then was extremely common on the left, which was, well, the working class is voting against their own economic interests because they're distracted with cultural issues. They'll say the Republicans, they rile up the working class, the traditional working class, with social conservatism or patriotism or pro-life or something like that. And that distracts the workers from what's really in their interest, their class interests. So what the working class really needs to do is forget about all these cultural issues and side with the left and be for universal health care or something like that. Now there are a lot of things that were wrong with the thesis that Frank advanced. One of which is that the working class voters, including the traditional white working class, voting patterns are not nearly as monolithic as what he was claiming. But I think a bigger problem is this. It seems to me that in a society like the United States, and increasingly like other developed countries, it would be rather difficult to have class solidarity when you have a society that is fragmented into multiple tribes and an increasingly greater number of tribes. I have noticed that class-based politics has made a comeback in recent years, but it's come from multiple directions. Within the Democratic Party, you have somebody like Bernie Sanders. Within the Republicans, you had Trump. But all of this is happening within the context of tribal politics. That is, each tribe may have a class-based insurgency within its own ranks or something like that. But you don't see nearly as much crossover between tribes around class issues. You do see some. In fact, I'd argue the reason Trump won the election in 2016 was because he was able to flip the Rust Belt states. He wasn't able to retain that demographic nearly as well in 2020, and I think that's the real reason he lost. He actually underperformed in that kind of white male without a college education demographic, and then he increased his performance in virtually every other demographic. So there is some truth to that. But more and more what I see is the wider society fragmenting into tribes. And then you have within each tribe, perhaps you have a sector that has an economic interest, but any kind of class politics is going to take place within the context of a tribe. And we see that on the right as well. We see just the other day I saw where Tom Cotton and Mitt Romney were trying to introduce some kind of legislation saying, well, we want to raise the minimum wage, which goes against Republican economic orthodoxy. But then they were saying, but it's going to be on the condition that we implement the E-Verify immigration, whatever thing, so that employers can't hire illegal immigrants. All right. Well, obviously, this is a really cynical move on these guys' part because they know the left is never going to go for that. They know that the left is always going to put cultural politics first and say, oh, no, we're not going to be for the minimum wage increase if it means putting further restrictions on immigration. Meanwhile, though, it gives them a means to rally their own followers in rural Utah, wherever they're from, saying, "Oh, look, we're trying to advance your economic interest," and we see other things like that coming from the right. We see this national conservatism and national populism, and I think in the future we'll see more people from the Republican side advocating for kind of Christian democratic like economic policies, at least sort of as half measures. But I don't see any kind of multi-cultural or multi-ethnic or cross-ideological class politics emerging. And I have some experience with this because for some time I held to the position that was kind of like what Edward Limonov used to advance in Russia back in the 90s, which was there's no left or right. There's only the system and then those against the system. There are variations of that. There's the populist. There's no left or right. There's populist, and then there's elitist, or then there's the statist and anti-statist, or decentralist and centralist, and then class is another kind of topic like that as well. And what I have found each time with these kinds of things, certainly within the context of American politics, is that the tribal identities always seem to come first. That whatever somebody's views on economic issues, whatever their views on, say, foreign policy and war and all these kinds of things, the tribal affiliation seems to take priority. And I was actually talking about this a while back with a student of mine who is from Jamaica. And she was saying in Jamaica, politics primarily is about class. It's rich people versus poor people. You have rich people who don't want to pay taxes, and then poor people who in rural areas and all that who need infrastructure and that kind of stuff. And she was saying, but the problem with the United States is that everybody fights over everything all the time. There's no agreement on anything. So it's sort of just everybody against everybody. And I see that as being the barrier to trying to build this kind of, working class solidarity, whatever, that some of these people from the left, certainly some people from the left and a few from the right have started talking about.
Yeah. So Logos, so I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. The more I was listening to Keith's response and thinking about what I wanted to say, the more dimensions keep coming up for this. We're going to try to stick to 3 to keep my response manageable. So the first dimension I want to bring up is the one that me and you already talked about, Todd. We made that video about why the left has a hard time organizing. And the central thesis of that video was that you get massive diseconomies of scale when you start adding in all these different ancillary issues. And the reason that happens is because, okay, I mean, let's just take something really easy like the trans issue or immigration, right? You have all these workers and they have different cultural issues and cultural backgrounds and stuff like that. And so maybe some are more religious and some aren't religious, or maybe, some have experience getting like outsourced from their own jobs. Like IBM in the 90s had to train their own replacements for immigrants and things like this. They finally find other work. They're on hard times again, right? There's all these different histories. And so if you say, okay, workers, we're going to unite, we're going to get you some fair conditions. Oh, and by the way, we're also going to fight for increased mass immigration so we can share our wealth with more of the world. Well, all these people with these causal histories are going to go, well, I'd love to work with you on this whole better economics thing, but you're bloody insane if you think I'm going to train my replacement again. What is wrong with you people, right? So the more issues you try to tack on, what that does is it actually fragments your base into intersectionality. And so you have people who care about immigration issues, people who care about working class issues. And once you say, we're to look at both those things, you're now only appealing to the subsection of the population that believes in both at the same time. Good luck building a coalition once you fragment that enough places. So that was the core thesis of our video. The next thing that I was thinking about is something that was brought up by Marx of all people. When Marx said, look, when the values of society start changing, it's usually not from the moral goodness of the heart of the society that changes the values. It's because something fundamental has changed about capital that necessitates the values. So look at the whole diversity is our strength thing. How much of that is to do with the fact that never before have we had technology where we can fly people around the world to take jobs. We have communications technology where you can put out, you want employees, rather. You can broadcast over the entire world and mine the most intelligent people from all the biggest countries to bolster your companies. So like never before have we been able to replace humans with other humans with such expediency. And so when the capital is now based on the information economy, we're not so much outsourcing factory goods as the majority of our production, but intellectual goods, then we have a prime real estate on intellect. And so you want to get it wherever you can from all over the world. And the more that our capitalist system, Marx would say, would reflect that, the more you're going to see calls to things that will value those mechanisms post hoc. So this fetishization with mass immigration is actually you being played by capital to value the people who may ultimately be replacing you for your next job because they can. I thought that was a pretty poignant point made by Marx. Now, he didn't bring up the idea of, airplanes and mass communication because it wasn't there in his day. But I took his broader point and kind of ran with it. His point was slavery. Slavery used to be a norm way back in history. Slavery started becoming morally abhorrent when we started being able to use factory and machine labor instead of forced human labor. And so capitalism outmoded slavery as a mode of production. And so there you go. That's one of the transitions he saw. And so Marx is concerned with whenever something changes in society, it's because some economic condition changes underneath of it, which then brings me kind of to my point 3. It piggybacks on points 1 and 2. The other thing that Marx brought up specifically in the Communist Manifesto was this repeated penchant for revolutions in history to not actually change the fundamentals of the economy. So Marx brought up the French Revolution and said this wasn't like a revolution of the working class versus the owner class. This was a revolution of some of the working class operating on behalf of middle-class merchants who would be new capital versus working class people who like the aristocracy, who were old capital. As the French Revolution was just new capital versus old capital. So if what I've said before are right about the values and about the diseconomies of scale and so forth and so on, what you have is this very Marxian dynamic whereby these appeals to the working class to join our movements, to join our solidarity, might just be insidious requests by new capital to join the fad movement against old capital. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. I was going to add something on top of that, but I just forgot what it was. So I think I'm going to pass the mic.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, this is definitely an interesting subject. With what Logos just said, as Keith was kind of giving the introduction, it appeared that, Yeah, there's just a lot of variables at play, and it kind of changed what I was going to initially say with quite a bit. So, yeah, first of all, there's a potential problem with organizing labor with a diverse society because, as we've all sort of been getting at so far, because the working class of various ethnicities and races, I mean, these groups, first of all, have potentially very different visions of the future in mind. And when there are additional barriers between different working classes, like, I mean, we've got various things like, like hyper individualism and, a very American, a very unique American sense of consumerism, potentially frivolous social issues, language, religion, race, you name it. So with this list and potentially many other variables in mind, you're giving yourself more filters and more solidarity tests, if you will, to pass before you can successfully mobilize labor. Now, in the same way that I enjoy watching Jimmy Dore and other shows on the left to kind of just, get a sense of what's going on, um, I also, take time and enjoy watching other people on the right and on the dissident right. And if you ever watch Keith Wood's channel, sometimes a conversation that will come up between him and different guests is that, well, how can we build a robust anti-capitalist coalition? And there's a lot of conversations that go on there that can we ally with the left for the sake of strategic convenience or out of necessity. And even right there, it's the conversation doesn't go too far because of all of these varying and opposing visions for a future. You can imagine that maybe there's perhaps a microscopic amount of socialist Democrats who or Bernie voters that would go over to a sort of right-wing socialism, an anti-woke type of socialism. But again, you've got too many moving parts. The only other interesting thing I think I can say on this initial comment is that there is an older sociologist named Milton Gordon who wrote a book called The Assimilation in American Life, and he argued that class solidarity is probably possible, but he characterized systematic ties across ethnic lines as sort of deviant. So he again, this was like the turn of the century, more kind of a view on sociology before a lot of the cultural left sort of claimed a monopoly on sociology. But that is definitely an interesting work, and I would recommend it for this conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the things that needs to be pointed out is, well, I argue that you cannot have a diverse worker base and organize it in the sort of way that the socialists would want to, precisely because this is exactly the kind of conditions that capital sets up to control the working class. So, to use an example that the left loves to talk about, as far as the exploitation of labor by capital, the Caribbean slave societies. So in the 2018 book, White Fury, Krister Petley writes, they presided over an intricate system of divide and rule. The slave trade helped this by ensuring that laborers on the plantation came from different West African regions and ethnic groups, or nations, as the planters sometimes called them. These different groups were not expected to cooperate. Taylor remarked that it was a general policy in Jamaica to have the Negroes on an estate as a mixture of nations so as to balance one set against another, to be sure of having 2/3 join the whites in the event of an uprising. The theory behind this was that groups of Africans would refuse to join the rebellions plotted by other groups, or by Creole slaves, choosing instead to serve their white masters in the hope of rewards for their loyal service, and rebellious plots did indeed often founder on these sorts of divisions, failing to attract adequate support to tip the balance of power in favor of the rebels. Exactly. I mean, this is literally what you're talking about, Logos, the working class serving new capital. This is not a revolutionary environment. This is clearly the left replicating a control grid of diverse, divided people which was already perfected in the plantations of the Caribbean. So really, it's patently absurd. We also have Whole Foods, which is owned by Amazon, and their heat map, where they increase diversity to lower the risk of unionization. This is from The Verge, where they have a snippet from the report. Store risk metrics include average store consumption, average total store sales, and a diversity index that represents the racial and ethnic diversity of every store. Stores at a higher risk of unionizing have lower diversity and lower employment compensation, as well as higher total store sales and higher rates of worker compensation claims, according to the documents. So again, they know that homogeneous working bases are more likely to unionize. Now, the left then might say, well, that's just the legacy of reactionary, racial in-group preferences. Well, okay, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that problem hasn't been solved. And you can't pretend that you can act as if that's not a problem. And then furthermore, classic left, the classic Marxists, and even Noam Chomsky would have admitted this, that in some sense you have to have a new socialist man in order to make this work. And the new socialist man is only created under the new material conditions of socialism. So you can't assume the new socialist man exists before the material conditions of socialism exist. So if you're going to argue that these things are reactionary and not to be done away with, well, okay, but they can only be done away with after the revolution. So you have to accept their reality now in order to create the material conditions of socialism. And it really just goes to show that the people that purport to be socialists today are not really socialists at all. This sort of gets into what you've said, Keith, before about lifestyle anarchism or lifestyle socialism. It's an aesthetic. It's a lifestyle. I mean, none of these people are going to be deported to a foreign country or go to Siberia for the sake of the revolution like old school anarchists and Bolsheviks used to do. And that's sort of my thought on the matter. I think we'll give it back to you, Logos.
Yeah, so what you said about the socialist man actually didn't quite remind me of a point because I thought of it sooner, but it segues nicely into this last point that I was actually going to make and forgot. So one more thing that Marx brings up in the Communist Manifesto is that there's a marked difference between political socialists and the socialism in, say, his capital. The socialism in his capital is something that happens necessarily out of capitalism. It's just once capitalism's contradictions, the Hegelian sense happen, centralization happens, it occurs. But in the Communist Manifesto, he's talking about political socialist parties and how they're distinct from communist workers' parties and things like that. So the first thing that they differ on is that communist workers' parties are basically kind of like spontaneous uprisings of workers that have no one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter description. They are very much determined by the historical time, place, and culture of the workers that revolt. So if somebody wants to call themselves, say, a communist, and a bunch of truckers that love Trump think the election was rigged or something, and in response, they go on strike. Well, that's more communistic under a Marxist framework than what they themselves would try to foist on the workers, because it was themselves plotting this through their culture as a means to stop the capitalist flow in order to get some recompense in some sense, which led to Marx's discussion of what socialists are as a political party. And these are people that will take working class issues and put them on like a mask. And they'll put them on like one of many masks they wear. Racial issues, social issues. They have all these different masks they put on whenever they have to go out in public and talk on behalf of some group they claim to be on behalf of. Now, the goal of the socialist isn't actually to address these problems for Marx. The goal of the socialist is to fundamentally remake society into their own particular image. They're social planners first, problem solvers second. And in fact, so long as these problems exist, that perpetually gives the socialist power to act on behalf of these unresolved problems. So socialists actually have an incentive to keep these problems unsolved. So that's the first thing I want to note. But this also leads into another discussion that Marx thought about socialists. Now, this I didn't hear directly from Marx. I've been listening to Thomas Sowell's book on Marxism, where he's describing Marxist philosophy. And he was talking about a section in Marx where Marx was describing the difference between socialistic materialism and his version of materialism. Now, under socialistic materialism, since all materialists believe that environment has some impact on the actions of human beings, the socialists think that, if we just manipulate the environment, we can make a perfect human being. And Marx was absolutely horrified at this. He thought it was a trick. He said that what you do is the goal of manipulating the the environment is to increase the amount of free choice available to people within the environment so they can fully self-actualize themselves as human beings, so they can fully weight all their decisions, their consequences, and so forth. And if you manipulate the environment so that they just behave a certain way, it's kind of taking something away from them fundamental to get what you want. So Marx hated it. And so this is another thing that Marx saw in the socialists, is that in being social planners that manipulate the environment this way, they do have this sort of, yes, you will completely understand once you accept the environment in our image kind of air about them that even Marx and some Marxists find absolutely detestable. And we can see this pop up in the modern day. I mean, me and you have talked quite a bit about the Birmingham situation in the UK, where the Socialist Workers' Party that owns these schools there are trying to indoctrinate working class Muslim children and like LGBT stuff and whatnot. And the Muslims are like, no, we're not having it. This is stupid. You're not gonna mess with our children, right? But again, it's not about the working class solidarity of Muslims that's a prime concern. It's this aesthetic view of society that accepts LGBT people that comes first, and they will try to impose it on the children of the people they claim to be in support of. And so that's the kind of thing that Marx was terrified of with respect to socialists. So the socialist man thing, I think, is a good point.
Yeah, and another point before I give this to you, Keith, is a lot of this discussion about these extreme minorities lines up with your, I think, 2007 article is Extremism in Defense of Sodomy, No Vice. It's an obviously anti-revolutionary activity, and that's what you pointed out, and got you into a bit of trouble. So I'll hand the ball over to you, Keith.
Well, I have a great deal of experience with this issue on a somewhat personal level because going way back for decades, I've been an anarchist for about 35 years, and probably the first 5 years or so of that, I was your standard brand, Noam Chomsky type of anarchist, leftist anarchist. And I used to actually belong to the IWW, and I also belonged to the IWA, which included the C&T of Spanish Civil War fame. So I came at it from this kind of anarcho-syndicalist class solidarity type of outlook. And back in those days, I would notice things that seemed incongruous and didn't make any sense. I remember one incident. This was in San Francisco. I was at a gathering of anarchists in San Francisco, and we were having this meeting, this workshop-like thing on labor solidarity and class politics and all the usual stuff. And it was a room full of people, and some of them were all talking about the left politics they were into. They were really into the gay rights thing. It was San Francisco in the 80s, and then they were into the pro-choice thing. This was back when the abortion wars were going on, and you had people blockading clinics and all that. Well, there was one guy in the room who said, "Wait a minute, don't you know that abortion is infanticide for blacks, and that homosexuality, as the Marxists said, is bourgeois degeneracy?" And of course, everyone's mouth falls open like, what did he say? Interestingly, this guy was black, and he was the only black person in the entire room, right? And then I started to think about it, and I thought, well, he's got a point. I mean, what does any of that have to do with class solidarity? What does someone's sexual interest or orientation or somebody's beliefs about abortion, what does that really have to do with economics? Anarcho-syndicalism is an economic theory. I had a parallel experience with that in the IWW probably a couple of years later. A very, what would today be called a cultural Marxist or woke or type faction got control of the national office of the IWW, which was headquartered in Chicago at the time. And there was the monthly publication that used to come out called The Industrial Worker that used to come out every month. And they started giving the national publication this kind of theme. In one issue, they published a centerfold of a fetus, like a fold out centerfold, like in a pornographic magazine or the old style, Playboy magazines. Only there's a fetus pictured in the centerfold, and then they had a slogan like, next time you value a woman, a fetus over a woman, jerk off to a picture of a fetus or something like that. This created controversy in the IWW because the IWW was at the time an eclectic enough group that it actually included some pro-life people, like some Catholic worker, Christian Catholic type of people who had a pro-life viewpoint. It also thought that it also included some feminists who thought this was actually sexist, and it created controversy. I would also notice that when I was working with some of these same groups, we used to do strike support work, and I worked on a number of big strikes. One was the Greyhound bus workers, there was the Eastern Airlines workers, there was the Pittston Coal Company, a number of them. But what I would find is I would get my groups of anarchists and Marxists and all that together to go out and work on the picket lines with these people, or go to their encampment in the coal mines in Southwest Virginia and Kentucky and places like that. And I would have all of my, very far left, hippie-ish anarchist associates. And a lot of these people, of course, were, working class roughnecks. I remember taking a group of anarchists once to meet some striking Greyhound bus workers. And these were all these very gruff old white guys. And they started talking about the N-word policemen that are watching them while they're striking or picketing and all of that. And I started realizing, well, there's obviously some cultural conflicts here. This is not really a working class solidarity that's going on here. In addition to the fact that most of the time the workers wouldn't even show up for picket duty. They would just collect their strike pay and stay at home and drink beer and stuff like that. I started seeing the limitations to this kind of viewpoint through experience. And it's still like that. It's still like that. Like I know one of you were talking about this Keith Woods fellow who talks about, building a coalition with the left among, left and right anti-capitalism. That's an idea that gets attacked from the left quite a bit. They call it the Red-Brown Alliance, and it's supposedly some sinister fascist plot to infiltrate the left and that kind of stuff. Jimmy Dore actually gets accused of that. He gets accused of fostering the Red-Brown Alliance or whatever it's supposed to be. Jill Stein actually is supposedly a Red-Brown or something or other. I've been told I am one, so whatever, But but I think that the point being is that, it seems to me that at least at this point in time, tribe comes before class most of the time. And I think it was probably always like that. I mentioned the example of how the Social Democratic parties acted during the First World War. But even back in those days, if you look at the historic labor movement, the mainstream labor movement was not Marxism or anything like that. That was kind of on the fringe. The mainstream labor movement tended to be, relatively conservative in the sense that they would say things like, oppressing workers is un-American and un-Christian and against the family and stuff like that. In fact, Caleb Maupin is like one of the few people on the left today who actually points this out. That like the old-fashioned labor left was not this kind of counterculture, kind of transgressiveness for its own sake type of milieu. And even groups like the IWW and all of that, they were kind of on the margins back in the day, I know one time, again, this was when I was in the IWW, I had an anarchist guy tell me, he said, I was reading some things about the history of the IWW, and did you know there was racism in the IWW early on? And I'm like, well, I would imagine so. It was the 1910s with, 1910s, social norms and that kind of stuff. So I imagine at least some of that would be present. So it appears this has always been an issue. And I think the real point is the tribe comes before the class interest. And I think that's particularly true in a society like ours, where the society is so diverse on one hand and yet so fragmented into these warring tribes.
Terminal philosophy, your thoughts?
Right. Well, when someone had mentioned the challenges of well, let me put it this. I guess there's a small body of studies that that have suggested that racial minorities prefer not to risk the loss of stable work, say in America or Germany, for example. Logos or Todd mentioned the Whole Foods CEO and or maybe just the Whole Foods company with their purposeful placement of diverse groups in specific locations to lower the possibility of strikes and so forth. I mean, that's a decent case study right there for this subject. One of the more interesting challenges that modern day North American progressive or leftist types are facing is this sort of Herculean effort of convincing Central American and South American, Middle Eastern, and African immigrants of this intersectional project. Perhaps they think that the socialist man or the socialist individual, whatever the Marxist term is, will be made through this sort of century-long project of changing the culture of America away from this sort of Americana middle class image to this sort of acceptance of the U.S. becoming a sort of soft borders, acultural economic zone. Of course, I would argue at that point that you're getting closer to a world of mega corporation Blade Runner capitalism than you are of some sort of 20th century vision of socialism. Yeah, and again, if you not that this would derail the leftist argument for intersectionality, but take a look at the early 20th century socialists and the early Marxists, and especially there's an interesting book called Karl Marx, a racist, who was written by a black guy, and sort of and again, not that this is this should be taken as sort of a knockdown argument, but when you do look at these sort of racial and cultural and sort of the views that Marx had of race and sort of Europe as this unique place in history, well, he was almost closer to like a type of Nordicist than he was as some type of transhumanist type of a person. I think he gets a free pass because he's the author of Das Kapital and so on and so forth. But I mean, he was pretty rigid in his racial views, and so with someone who is obsessed with theory, I guess you have to do. I mean, people have to do this all over the place, ideologically and politically. You kind of have to pick what to defend and what you are against. But I mean, Karl Marx wasn't some. It's difficult to imagine him being some pro-diversity, pro-intersectional type of a person, just on a theoretical level. But yes, it's difficult. I mean, I think. You always hear the term late stage capitalism, and whether that's just kind of a sexy slogan like calling your enemies a fascist or whatever. It's I don't really see capitalism going away. I can see sort of something like a post-capitalism coming about, where you've got maybe perhaps something like an Andrew Yang, where you've got like a UBI type of a thing, and that might do something interesting culturally, where since everyone's getting their checks every month or every whatever the time is, that might create a type of I don't want to say a socialist atmosphere for mobilizing labor, but you would have a more probably. I guess what I'm trying to say, you'd have a more common working class foundation with something like that. I guess my point is that UBI would create a sort of I don't know, kind of a lowest common denominator starting foundation for a potential socialist atmosphere for organizing labor. Sorry, that was a bit of a garble, but let me think about that. I can probably refine it, but I think you guys know what I'm getting at there.
Yeah, so we're gonna shift over to the final thoughts, but I'll sort of begin with mine. But besides the obvious claim that any sort of radically diverse workspace is itself a mechanism used by capital to control the working class and therefore has no revolutionary potential, I think the problem here is that there's been a kind of mutation of the IWW slogan, "Build the new society in the shell of the old." They think, socialists today think that you can have the new socialist man within these quote unquote socialist revolutionary groups without the material conditions of socialism, which of course is absurd because all classic socialist Marxist literature says that the new socialist man can only develop in an already existing material condition that is socialist. But what I think has happened is they've taken that idea and said, well, we're going to assume what we want right now, even if it doesn't actually exist. And then we're going to make plans from that assumption. And I predict because of that, it isn't going to work. I'll give it over to you, Logos. You go first.
Okay. Yeah, if we're jumping into final thoughts, let's see. I've been quoting Marx, if not directly, if paraphrasing him the whole time, and that's not because like I've just suddenly become some sort of Marxist between the last time I was on and this time I was on. My point in all this is to take a classically left position like Marx or somebody and show even from that perspective why this problem seems to crop up and why this is, let's just throw it back to the left and say this was predicted to be a problem by your guy, and you haven't even begun trying to fix it. You have no idea what's going on. You're either being idiots for new capital, or you're being, socialist, social planning socialists, bourgeois socialists, instead of, actual communists like Marx wanted you to be, right? That's not a right-wing criticism. They can't look at that and go, oh, you're just a fascist. It's like, I'm sorry. I mean, this is what Marx said about you. If I wanted to go forth to other criticisms, I could pull from like Thorstein Veblen, who, the theory of business enterprise went on and on and on about the machine process and how the machine process kind of subsumes everything. And so he would have a take on Marx's interesting idea that, morality changes because the requirements for capital in a capitalist society change. And Veblen would kind of integrate that into his analysis about the machine process and how we kind of compartmentalize and cookie cutterize human beings and human relations in this way. So this isn't even a full-on right-wing criticism either. I mean, Thorstein Veblen, I don't think he was like super far left. He had like a lot of criticisms of the socialists. He was not super far right either. He was just kind of like his own weird, quirky individual, right? So that's two different sources of criticism I could point to from the left or left adjacent thought why the left has this problem, before we even get to like me and Todd criticizing from the right and say a view of like diseconomies of scale. And then we have, Keith's examples about, where he used to live. I mean, there's just such a body of knowledge from the left, from all these different places about where this problem exists. The only thing I can conclude about this is that the left doesn't want to fix it because they know, right? There's some sense in which I think, and Jimmy Dore even thinks, he says this all the time, that the left is controlled opposition. But then again, I watched Jimmy Dore have this talk with Cornel West, and Jimmy Dore was just like, aha, I wonder why all these Christians aren't socialists. It's like, well, Marx could have told you why the Christians aren't socialists. Christians don't believe in using the idea of material environment to mess with people, right? That's not a Christian thing to do. So even Jimmy Dore, who will get on the left for being controlled opposition for intersectionality and whatever else, he's still parroting the talking points of social reform socialists, which, as Marx pointed out, are actually the problem. So I don't know, maybe some don't want to fix it because they know it's a problem and they're actually secretly working for new capital, as Marx said you always have to be aware of with, revolutionary movements. Some of them just have no idea and are just useful idiots for those social planners who work for new capital. I don't know. We're quite a tangled up mess here. And fundamentally, I think that with all the knowledge out there about why this problem exists, somebody doesn't want it to be fixed on the left. And that's why the problem still persists.
Exactly. Terminal philosophy. What are your thoughts? Final statement.
Right. Well, I guess just as for my closing statement, progressives and leftists have, among many, I think they really have, just as Logos was saying, this is such a tangled mess and so many moving parts and variables. I guess in my attempt to make an original closing statement, the leftists really do have a unique cultural problem. And what I mean by that is that, when you take just kind of a broader historical survey of early 20th century socialism and revolutions, or attempts at revolutions or civil wars or things like that, you get, and even in the mid 20th century, you have individuals like Lenin or Che Guevara. These people are, when you look at aspects of their life, I mean, a lot of these guys they were like rampant workaholics. I mean, especially with like Che Guevara. I mean, I think he saw himself as, yeah, again, sort of the right-hand man of Cuba's dictatorship, but also, I mean, he saw himself as this rugged sort of common man, like infantryman almost for the revolution. And and Lenin himself, worked. I mean, again, these guys stayed up late writing and corresponding and organizing. Now, that's not to say that that doesn't happen all across the left, but I mean, you have. In my life, I spent a lot of time with a lot of different musicians and a lot of people on the sort of the progressive left and socialist left and so on and so forth. At the current moment, I mean, if I were to take the temperature of that sort of broader cultural group of people, currently they're just not very good at organizing politically on the ground for all the reasons that we've just mentioned. There is just too many different types of people with competing visions of the future. There is one interesting guy. There's a guy named Christopher Halali that was running for a congressional position in Vermont. Christopher Halali is this guy who was born in northern Iraq or Kurdistan or eastern Turkey, something like that, and he was in the U.S. Army for a while. And I think and then he got all these sort of he got degrees in several different universities across the world. He speaks several different languages. He and his wife are these hardworking gardeners and volunteers and so on and so forth. So I think if there is any, if you were a leftist or a progressive or a pro-socialist or a self-described communist, you would kind of have to, well, this is kind of oversimplified, but honestly, you'd have to put down the bong and turn off the Rick and Morty, and you'd have to become this militaristic type of workaholic. But the greater challenge beyond that is convincing this very diverse group of leftists and people who are vaguely in your political camp to become just like you. And then if you have more of this, then when you have a group of people like that forming, I think then organizing labor can become more of a possibility. But again, with different immigrants coming in and different language barriers and many socialists from South America, for example, like to retain their Catholicism. And, but if you talk to a Marxist theorist who, has a position at Brown University, well, religion is not the way. So you've got, it is just such a mess for organizing labor, whether or not you are a socialist coming from the left or the right, or you're simply looking for alternatives to neoliberalism. The situation just currently isn't very good, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Keith, you get the last word.
Yeah, there's a lot I could say to all of that. It was pointed out earlier by one of you that during the French Revolution, Marx pointed out later that what you had was a situation where you had sectors of the working class fighting on behalf of sectors of the bourgeoisie who were trying to overthrow the aristocracy. And along with that, you had other sectors of the working class that were aligned with the aristocracy. And if you look at American politics today, that's how it exactly is. In many ways, the class system that we have in the United States is analogous to the 19th century because you have this traditional elite, the old bourgeoisie or whatever, the Chamber of Commerce types, that is slowly being superseded by this newer tech elite and these newer, more high-tech industries and financialization and all of those kinds of things. So industrial capitalism is being replaced with finance capital and also with digital capital. So you have this kind of I guess the Marxists would say it's an intra-bourgeois conflict. And then you also have sectors of the working class and the poor and all of that who are on different sides of that, depending on their tribal affiliations and geographical location and all sorts of things like that. So it's an exact repeat of what happened in the past. And with the addition, though, that we have a much wider level of social fragmentation, due in part to population diversity, but also due in part to more and more different ideas being worked into the mix, the ideological mix. An example that I like to use is this. On one hand, I think that the way the United States is moving, we're moving more towards a society with where the dominant social norms, at least among the privileged classes, are more like those of Western Europe. I mean, the American educated classes have always said, Western Europe, that's where it's at. We should be more like the Western Europeans. They're more socially liberal and yada yada. And I think we are moving more in that kind of a direction culturally. At the same time, we're moving in a direction that's more like Latin America in terms of our class structures. We have very wide disparities between rich and poor, and also related levels of corruption and violence and crime and civil unrest and all those kinds of things. But then I think another thing that's interesting to look at is we're in many ways becoming more like the Middle East in the United States, because if you look at political conflict in the Middle East, and certainly there's plenty of it, what really fuels all that? Economics is certainly a factor in all of that, but the main battle lines tend to be tribe and sect. That is, what tribe do you belong to? What clan do you belong to? What ancestral whatevers do you belong to? Along with whatever sect of whatever religion you belong to, whatever type of Islam or whatever it is. And more, I see the United States politics being more like that, more like the Middle East. Only instead of tribe and sect per se in a traditional sense, political ideologies are the new religions, and they overlap with traditional religions. And then political interest groups are the new tribes, and they overlap with the more traditional ideas of tribes. But if the United States were to be unraveled into a type of civil war, a violent conflict type of situation, the kind of conflict we would have would be like what we've seen in places like Lebanon or Syria or Iraq or some of these places where it's tribe, against sect against sect. It wouldn't be something like the Spanish Civil War, where it's the left against the right, and that was really the primary dividing line. Now, there is an element of that. I think that if we had to pick one dividing line in the United States today, it would be between the proponents of this new woke capitalism, that is the left wing of the capitalist class and all of their constituents. And what they have in common is only one thing, and that's their disdain for the traditional WASP culture, the white Anglo-Saxon bourgeois traditional culture, the Protestant Christian capitalist, whatever, traditional culture. And the one thing that unites the so-called right wing or whatever, the opposition, is that it's a disdain for wokeness, either whether you have liberals who think wokeness has gone too far, or traditional conservatives who are always opposed to it, or whatever. That's really the dividing line there, this cultural conflict between these different sectors of the elite, the woke capitalists versus the old Chamber of Commerce types. But then within each of those camps, you have all of these different tribes that are fragmented between each other. And then you have plenty of tribes that don't really belong to either group. Like, I don't know that the kinds of people who were participated in a lot of the riots last summer, like people burning down police stations, I don't know that they really did that because they have any loyalty to the blue tribe or care the first thing about the blue tribe. I think they're really more a collection of tribes of their own. But so I see that as being the barrier to any kind of class solidarity movement in the United States, like the left envisions. The dividing lines are not about class; they're about tribe and cultural affiliation and sect, and increasingly that's becoming more and more fragmented.
All right. Again, thank you, Keith Preston, Logos, and Terminal Philosophy. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.